The ancient oak tree on Millfield's east side had stood for 3 centuries, its massive roots reaching deep into the Connecticut soil. Nobody paid much attention to Jake Morrison working beneath it during his lunch breaks, hauling away buckets of dirt and reinforcing timber. The townspeople saw what they expected to see, a blue-collar nobody killing time on a construction site. They had no idea Jake was a former Navy engineer who'd survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, or that the hobby project he'd been building for 2 years was actually a state-of-the-art survival bunker equipped with air filtration, hydroponics, and enough supplies for 50 people. When the chemical plant explosion sent a deadly cloud of toxins rolling across Millfield, Jake's hidden sanctuary beneath the oak became the difference between life and death. Suddenly, the same wealthy families who'd never bothered learning his name were pounding on his reinforced door, offering millions for entry. But Jake had built this place for a reason the rich couldn't buy their way out of. What secret from his past had driven him to prepare for this exact moment? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sirens had started at 6:47 a.m. Jake Morrison was already dressed, coffee cooling on his kitchen counter as he watched the news unfold on his phone. The Millfield chemical processing plant, the same facility that employed half the town and made the Blackwood family richer by the day, was burning. Black smoke billowed into the morning sky, and the emergency broadcast system crackled with words that made his blood run cold: toxic gas leak, immediate evacuation, shelter in place. He'd been expecting this for 2 years. Jake grabbed his go-bag and sprinted toward the oak tree, his work boots pounding against the dew-soaked grass. Behind him, the town was waking up to chaos. Car alarms blared as panicked residents fled their homes. The acrid smell of burning chemicals already tainted the air, carried by the easterly wind that Jake had studied obsessively since breaking ground on his project. The entrance to his bunker was invisible to casual observers, a reinforced steel hatch camouflaged beneath manufactured roots and carefully arranged soil. Jake's fingers found the biometric scanner hidden in the bark, and the heavy door hissed open, revealing a ladder that descended into clean, filtered air. As he sealed himself inside, Jake's mind flashed back to Kandahar Province, 2019, the chemical attack that had killed 17 members of his engineering unit while he'd been trapped in a collapsed tunnel, helpless and breathing poison for 6 hours until rescue arrived. The doctors said he was lucky to survive. Jake called it preparation for what was coming. The bunker hummed with quiet efficiency around him. LED strips illuminated concrete walls lined with emergency supplies, water purification systems, and banks of monitors showing feeds from hidden cameras positioned throughout Millfield. The air tasted clean and filtered, a sharp contrast to the death creeping across his hometown above. On the screens, Jake watched his neighbors discover what shelter in place meant when the shelter itself was killing you. The Hendersons tried to seal their basement with plastic sheets. Mrs. Chen loaded her grandchildren into her car, only to realize the roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles as drivers succumbed to the invisible killer. The lucky ones collapsed quickly. The unlucky ones stumbled through the streets, gasping and clawing at their throats. Then came the first knock. 3 sharp raps on the hatch above, followed by a voice Jake recognized. Mayor Patricia Blackwood, whose family owned the very plant now poisoning the town. Her usual commanding tone had cracked into desperation. "Please, someone help us. My daughter, she can't breathe." Jake's finger hovered over the button that would open the hatch. Through his cameras he could see them: Patricia Blackwood, her husband Richard, and their teenage daughter Melissa. The same family who'd opposed his permit requests, who'd called his construction work an eyesore at town meetings, who'd never once acknowledged his existence despite living 3 blocks away for the past 5 years. More knocking came from other directions. His hidden cameras revealed the Ashfords, the Sterlings, the Cromwells. Millfield's entire social elite had somehow traced the source of clean air to his oak tree. They pressed against the camouflaged entrance like moths drawn to the only light in a dying world. "We know you're down there," Richard Blackwood shouted. "We'll pay anything. Name your price." Jake settled into his command chair, watching the monitors as more desperate faces appeared. These people had built their fortunes on the chemical plant, had ignored safety warnings for decades to maximize profits, had treated workers like Jake as disposable. Now their money meant nothing, and their lives depended on a man whose name they'd never bothered to learn. But they would learn it now. And they would learn why Jake Morrison had spent 2 years preparing for this exact moment, because the chemical plant explosion wasn't an accident, and the toxic cloud rolling across Millfield was just the beginning. The screaming started at 3:47 a.m. Marcus jolted awake in his basement workshop, the sound of sirens piercing through the concrete walls above. His hand instinctively reached for the radio beside his workbench, fingers finding the emergency frequency he'd programmed years ago. Static crackled, then a voice broke through. Panicked, professional, deadly serious. "Chemical breach at Meridian Industries. Unknown toxin released into atmosphere. Immediate evacuation of all residents within 15-mile radius. Seek sealed shelter immediately." His blood turned to ice. Meridian Industries, the chemical plant where he'd worked construction just last month, installing what they'd told him was safety improvements. The same plant owned by Harrison Blackwood, who'd stood in his Italian leather shoes watching Marcus lay concrete, never bothering to learn his name. The radio continued its urgent broadcast as Marcus moved with practiced efficiency through his workshop. His hands found the hidden panel behind his tool cabinet, pressing the sequence of buttons he'd memorized but prayed he'd never need. A section of the concrete wall slid away with a mechanical whisper, revealing the entrance to something no one above ground knew existed. For 15 years, Marcus had been preparing, not for this exact scenario, but for the day when the world above would become uninhabitable. Call it paranoia, call it wisdom. His grandfather's stories of surviving the London Blitz had planted seeds that grew into something more substantial than most people's weekend hobbies. The bunker stretched deeper than anyone would guess, carved from bedrock with his own hands during countless nights and weekends. Solar panels disguised as roof patches fed hidden batteries, a sophisticated air filtration system, military surplus he'd acquired through connections most suburbanites didn't know existed, water reclamation, hydroponics, enough supplies for months. He sealed the entrance behind him and descended into his underground sanctuary, emergency lighting casting long shadows on reinforced walls. The air tasted clean, filtered, safe. Above him, he could hear the chaos beginning, car engines starting, doors slamming, voices rising in panic. Marcus moved to his communication station and switched on the external cameras he'd installed around his property. The street was already filling with neighbors stumbling from their houses, some still in pajamas, all clutching phones and keys and children. The Hendersons from next door stood on their manicured lawn, Sandra Henderson still in her silk nightgown, looking lost and terrified. The same woman who'd complained to the Homeowners Association about his unsightly work truck parked in his own driveway. Through his headphones, Marcus monitored emergency frequencies. The scope of the disaster was becoming clear. The toxin was airborne, invisible, and spreading faster than evacuation efforts could manage. Chemical burns on contact, respiratory failure within hours of exposure, the kind of industrial nightmare that turns suburban neighborhoods into ghost towns. A pounding on his front door made him freeze. Through the camera feeds, he watched Harrison Blackwood himself standing on Marcus's porch, still wearing what looked like a $1,000 suit despite the hour. Behind him stood his wife Victoria, clutching a small dog, and their teenage daughter Emma, looking younger than her 17 years without makeup and designer clothes. "Please," Blackwood was shouting at the door. "I know you're in there. We need help." Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief. The man who'd treated him like furniture, who'd walked past him for weeks without acknowledgement, was begging at his door. The irony would have been amusing if the circumstances weren't so dire. More figures appeared in his camera feeds. Dr. Patricia Vance, the surgeon who lived 3 houses down, was running toward his property with her husband. Behind them came the Hendersons and others, all the people who'd made him feel invisible, who'd questioned his presence at neighborhood gatherings, who'd spoken about property values when his work truck stayed parked too long. They'd figured out what others hadn't yet, that the weird contractor at the end of the street might be their best chance for survival. Marcus's finger hovered over the external communication button. He could speak to them, let them know he was here, that safety existed just beneath their feet. The bunker could house 12 people comfortably, 20 in an emergency. These were his neighbors regardless of how they'd treated him. But opening that door would change everything. His secret would be exposed. His sanctuary would become a refuge for people who'd never given him a second thought until they needed something only he could provide. The toxin readings on his external sensors were climbing steadily. Soon, being outside would mean death. Whatever choice he made, he had to make it now. Marcus reached for the communication button as another desperate pounding echoed through his cameras. Outside, Harrison Blackwood was beginning to cough. The emergency broadcast crackled through Marcus's radio as he descended into the bunker's main corridor, the static-filled voice confirming his worst fears. Chemical plant explosion. Toxic clouds spreading rapidly through the valley. All residents advised to shelter in place immediately. The words felt hollow. Shelter in place meant death for anyone caught above ground when that yellow-green death rolled over Millbrook. Behind him, the sound of expensive shoes clicking against concrete echoed off the narrow walls. Victoria Ashworth's labored breathing mixed with her husband's muttered complaints about the cramped space. Their teenage daughter Emma hadn't spoken since they'd stumbled down the ladder, her designer dress now torn and dirty from the hurried descent. How much further? Richard Ashworth's voice carried the tone of a man unaccustomed to following others. This tunnel is barely wide enough for... You want to go back up? Marcus stopped abruptly, turning to face the small group. The beam from his headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating three faces that had never known real fear until today. Because that cloud's probably reached Pine Ridge by now. Your mansion's got what, standard HVAC? Maybe you sealed your windows real tight? Richard's mouth opened, then closed. Through the ceiling, a distant rumbling suggested vehicles fleeing along the highway, though Marcus suspected most wouldn't make it far enough. I thought you said this was temporary, Victoria whispered, pressing a silk scarf to her nose as if it could filter out the bunker's metallic smell. Until help arrives. Marcus resumed walking, his boots splashing through a shallow puddle that made Victoria gasp. Help's not coming for days, maybe weeks. That toxin doesn't just blow away like smoke. It settles, soaks into everything, ground, water, buildings. He paused at a heavy steel door marked with radiation symbols and a hand-painted sign, authorized personnel only. This is where we find out how bad you want to live. The door's electronic lock responded to Marcus's thumbprint with a soft beep. Inside, banks of monitors displayed maps, weather patterns, and radiation readings that painted a grim picture of the world above. Red zones spread across the digital landscape like spilled blood. Jesus Christ, Richard breathed, staring at the screens. Is that real time? Updated every 30 seconds. Marcus moved to a control panel, his fingers dancing across switches with practiced ease. Took me 15 years to build all this. Started the day I got hired at Ashworth Development and realized how little you people cared about the rest of us. Emma spoke for the first time since entering the bunker. You worked for my father? Site supervisor on the industrial complex project. Your daddy cut every corner he could to maximize profits. Substandard materials, rushed safety inspections, minimal emergency protocols. Marcus gestured toward the screens showing the spreading contamination. That plant that just blew? Your father approved the construction permits, even though the environmental impact studies warned about this exact scenario. Victoria's hand flew to her throat. That's not possible. Richard would never... Check the records, lady. Oh, wait, you can't. They're probably melting in the acid rain right about now. The bunker's ventilation system hummed to life, cycling fresh air through filters Marcus had designed himself. The space opened into a larger chamber lined with supplies, water barrels, preserved food, medical equipment, even a small library. It was Spartan but functional, everything the Ashworth mansion wasn't. Richard surveyed the supplies with calculating eyes. How long can this sustain? How many people? Depends on how many people, doesn't it? Marcus settled into a chair before the monitors, his back deliberately turned to his guests. Good news is, I planned for 6 people maximum. Bad news is, space comes at a premium down here. What do you mean? Victoria's voice climbed higher. Marcus swiveled to face them, his expression unreadable in the monitor's blue glow. Means everyone earns their keep. No passengers, no dead weight. Up there, your money bought you comfort, privilege, the right to look down on folks like me. Down here? He gestured around the utilitarian space. Different economy entirely. Emma moved closer to her parents, her young face pale with understanding. What kind of earning? Tasks, maintenance, following orders without question. And everyone gets one job that really matters, something that keeps us all alive. Fail at your job, threaten the group's survival. Marcus shrugged. Well, there's always the ladder back up. The monitors chimed softly, displaying updated contamination readings. The red zones had expanded significantly in just the past few minutes. This is insane, Richard sputtered. You can't just... Can't what? Save your lives? Marcus leaned back in his chair. Because that's exactly what I'm doing. Question is whether you're smart enough to let me. The bunker fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant sound of the filtration system. Above them, Millbrook was dying. Below, a new hierarchy was being born. The emergency broadcast crackled through Marcus's radio, the static barely masking the panic in the reporter's voice. Evacuation radius has been expanded to 15 miles. Symptoms include respiratory distress, skin lesions, and neurological damage within minutes of exposure. Seek immediate shelter. Marcus turned the volume down and surveyed his underground domain. The bunker stretched nearly 2,000 square feet beneath his modest house, carved from bedrock over 7 painstaking years. Steel-reinforced walls, independent air filtration, enough supplies to last months. What had started as a weekend hobby born from his grandfather's war stories had become an obsession that drained his savings and earned him mockery from neighbors who glimpsed the construction. The same neighbors who were now dead or dying above. His security monitors showed the chaos outside. Bodies lay twisted on sidewalks, their skin mottled with angry red welts. Cars had crashed into storefronts, their drivers overcome before they could escape. The chemical plant's explosion had released something far worse than anyone imagined. A thunderous pounding echoed from above, transmitted through the bunker's ceiling. Marcus climbed the reinforced ladder to his concealed entrance, peering through the periscope he'd installed. 5 figures huddled on his front porch, their expensive clothes torn and faces pale with terror. Even through the grainy lens, he recognized them instantly. Richard Blackstone, the real estate mogul who'd tried to force him from his home with legal threats and lowball offers. The man who'd called him human trash, cluttering up a prime development zone at last year's town hall meeting. Beside him cowered his wife Victoria, still clutching her designer purse like a shield. There was Dr. Patricia Henley, the surgeon who'd refused to treat his uninsured brother 3 years ago, letting him die in the emergency room waiting area. City Councilman David Chen stood with them, the same politician who voted to cut funding for the construction workers' union benefits. And trembling behind the group, young Jessica Blackstone, Richard's daughter, barely 18 and guilty only of being born into their world of privilege. Please, Richard's muffled voice carried through the sealed entrance. We know you have some kind of shelter down there. We saw the construction trucks, the deliveries. Marcus watched them through the periscope, his finger hovering over the intercom button. The irony wasn't lost on him. These people had spent years looking through him, dismissing him as invisible, expendable. Now their survival depended entirely on his mercy. We'll pay you. Victoria's shrill voice joined her husband's. Whatever you want. We have money, connections. Dr. Henley pressed close to the hidden entrance. There are others coming, a mob from downtown. They're killing anyone they think might have shelter. You have to let us in." Through his monitors, Marcus could see she wasn't lying. A group of desperate survivors was moving through the neighborhood, breaking into houses, dragging people into the toxic air when they found nothing useful. The chemical had driven some beyond madness into a primal, violent state. "My daughter," Richard's voice cracked. "Please, she's just a child. Take her at least. I'm begging you." Marcus studied Jessica through the lens. She reminded him of his own niece, the one who died because these same people had voted to close the local clinic. The girl pressed against the door, her breathing already labored from minimal exposure to the contaminated air. The bunker's air filtration system hummed quietly around him, cycling clean oxygen while the world above dissolved into chaos. His stockpiled food, water, and medical supplies represented 7 years of sacrifice. Every weekend, every paycheck, every moment of mockery from the community had led to this. He activated the intercom, his voice echoing across the porch. "I remember each of you." The figures above froze. Richard pressed his face against the door. Marcus Chen, listen, whatever happened before, we can work this out. Business is business, but this is life and death." "Business is business," Marcus repeated slowly. "Is that what you called it when you tried to steal my home? When you let my brother die? When you voted to eliminate our health coverage?" "We made mistakes," Dr. Henley called out. "But we're human beings. We have families, people who depend on us." The distant mob was 3 blocks away now, their angry voices carrying on the poisoned wind. Marcus watched Richard pull his daughter closer, genuine terror replacing his usual arrogance. Marcus's finger moved to the entrance controls. The bunker could accommodate 8 people comfortably, 12 in an emergency. He had enough supplies, enough space, enough filtered air to save them all. But salvation would come at a cost none of them had ever paid before. Their pride, their power, their certainty that wealth and status made them untouchable. The locks disengaged with a soft hiss. "Come down slowly," Marcus said into the intercom. "But understand something before you enter my world. Down here, your money means nothing. Your titles mean nothing. You live by my rules now, and the first rule is simple." The entrance swung open, revealing the ladder into safety. Everyone pays their debt. The heavy steel door groaned shut behind the last evacuee, sealing them all inside Marcus's underground sanctuary. The sudden silence felt oppressive after the chaos above, broken only by the hum of air filtration systems and the shallow breathing of 11 terrified people. Marcus surveyed his unexpected guests in the amber glow of LED strips that lined the bunker's walls. Senator Patricia Whitmore sat rigidly on a storage crate, her designer suit already wrinkled and stained. Beside her, tech mogul David Chen clutched his phone uselessly. No signal could penetrate 40 feet of concrete and steel. Real estate magnate Jonathan Hayes paced near the water filtration unit, his usual commanding presence reduced to nervous energy. The others, corporate executives, a federal judge, a pharmaceutical heiress, huddled in small groups, their faces masks of disbelief and growing dread. "This can't be happening," muttered Elizabeth Rothschild, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune. "When will the authorities contain this?" Marcus checked the atmospheric readings on his monitoring system. The numbers made his stomach clench. "Ma'am, based on what I'm seeing here, we could be looking at weeks before it's safe to go back up." "Weeks?" Hayes spun around, his face flushing red. "That's impossible. I have board meetings, congressional hearings. You have your life." Marcus cut him off. "That's what matters now." The bunker stretched roughly 40 by 60 feet, divided into sections Marcus had carefully planned over 15 years of construction. A compact kitchen occupied one corner, stocked with enough MREs and canned goods to feed a dozen people for months. Sleeping quarters consisted of 8 narrow bunks along one wall. He'd need to figure out arrangements for the overflow, a small medical station, rudimentary bathroom facilities, and his communication equipment completed the layout. Dr. Sarah Chen, David's younger sister and one of the city's top emergency physicians examined the medical supplies with professional interest. "This is impressive," she admitted grudgingly. "Military-grade antibiotics, surgical tools, even a portable defibrillator." "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan," Marcus replied. "Learned to prepare for the worst." Senator Whitmore's voice carried its usual authoritative tone, despite their circumstances. "Mr. Torres, I appreciate your hospitality, but surely you can contact the proper authorities. I have direct lines to FEMA, Homeland Security." Marcus gestured to his communication array. "Been monitoring emergency frequencies since this started. Every evacuation site within 50 miles has been compromised. Military's establishing a perimeter at the county line, but they're not sending rescue teams into the hot zone." The weight of that revelation settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. Judge Franklin Morrison, a man accustomed to controlling courtrooms with quiet authority, spoke for the first time since entering the bunker. "What exactly are we dealing with up there?" "Chemical plant explosion released something the emergency broadcasts are calling Agent 7, Marcus explained, reading from his notes. "Airborne toxin, lethal in parts per million concentrations. Causes respiratory failure within hours of exposure." Elizabeth Rothschild's face went pale. "My company, we consulted on some Defense Department chemical weapons research years ago. If this is what I think it is, then we're lucky to be alive," Dr. Chen finished grimly. David Chen looked up from his dead phone. "How do we know this place is actually safe? You could have just sealed us in a tomb." Marcus walked to a wall panel and opened it, revealing sophisticated atmospheric monitoring equipment. Independent air supply drawn from aquifer-level depths, triple filtered through chemical scrubbers. Positive pressure system prevents any contamination from seeping in. I've got backup power for 6 months, water recycling that could stretch our supply indefinitely. Hayes studied the readings with grudging respect. "You built all this yourself?" "Every bolt, every wire. Took me 15 years. Marcus's voice carried quiet pride. "Neighbors thought I was crazy, stockpiling for some fantasy apocalypse." "The fantasy is our reality now," Dr. Chen observed soberly. Senator Whitmore stood, attempting to reassert her authority. "Well then, I suggest we organize ourselves efficiently. Establish schedules, delegate responsibilities." "With respect, Senator," Marcus interrupted, "this is my bunker. My rules keep us alive." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. These were people accustomed to commanding others, to having their words carry the weight of law or vast fortunes. Being relegated to the status of dependent refugees in the domain of a man they'd never acknowledged as an equal clearly rankled. "What kind of rules?" Hayes asked carefully. Marcus looked each of them in the eye before responding. "Everyone contributes. Everyone follows safety protocols, and everyone shows respect for this place and each other." The unspoken implication hung in the recycled air, the same respect they'd never shown him in the world above. Now their survival depended entirely on the man they'd treated as invisible. Outside, the wind carried death through empty streets. Down here, the real test was just beginning. The first to break was Margaret Thornfield. Tommy watched from his position by the sealed entrance as the pharmaceutical heiress pressed her manicured fingers against the reinforced glass of the observation window. Her breath fogged the surface as she stared at the monitors displaying the outside world, a world that had become a graveyard in less than 6 hours. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the bunker's ventilation system. She was at boarding school in Connecticut. The wind patterns. Tommy didn't need to check his meteorological data to know Connecticut had been in the toxin's path since hour 2. He'd watched the satellite feeds, seen the invisible death creep across state lines like spilled ink on paper. The Kepler-9 compound moved faster than anyone had predicted, faster than evacuation protocols could match. "She's gone, isn't she?" Margaret's reflection wavered in the glass, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. Behind her, Harrison Blackwood shifted uncomfortably on one of the utilitarian benches Tommy had welded years ago. The steel had seemed excessive then, built for durability over comfort. Now it served its purpose as the oil executive struggled to find a position that didn't aggravate his obvious withdrawal symptoms. "How long until we can go outside?" Blackwood's question came out sharper than intended, his hands trembling as he reached for a water bottle. Tommy consulted his tablet, scrolling through atmospheric readings and decontamination projections. Minimum 72 hours for initial clearance. Full environmental safety? 2 weeks, maybe 3. The pharmaceutical heiress let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. 2 weeks. Jesus Christ, Tommy. 2 weeks in a bunker built by a man I wouldn't have looked twice at if he wasn't fixing my pool filter. Margaret. Judge Patricia Vance's voice carried the same authority it wielded in her courtroom. But here, in Tommy's domain, it seemed hollow. "We need to focus on survival, not recriminations." "Survival?" Margaret spun around, her designer dress wrinkled and stained with perspiration. "Do you understand what's happening up there? My company's stock is probably in free fall. My assets, my properties, my entire empire—" "Means nothing if you're dead," Tommy interrupted, not looking up from his monitors. "Which you would be if you'd stayed in your climate-controlled mansion with its fancy air purification system that filtered everything except military-grade toxins." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths. Tommy had tried to warn them, had attempted to explain why their expensive security systems were useless against what was coming. But rich people didn't listen to construction workers, especially ones who claimed to know about chemical weapons and atmospheric dispersal patterns. Victoria Sterling, the media mogul, sat in the corner methodically destroying her manicure, picking at each perfectly polished nail until the lacquer flaked away. "The networks," she said suddenly. "Are any of them still broadcasting?" Tommy switched to the communications array, cycling through emergency frequencies. Static filled the speakers, punctuated by occasional automated warnings and scattered distress calls from areas outside the contamination zone. "Local stations went dark around hour 4, he reported. "Emergency broadcasts are running on loop from Denver and Atlanta. Everything else—" He gestured at the wall of dead monitors. Harrison stood abruptly, pacing the narrow confines of the main chamber. "This is insane. We can't just sit here while our entire lives collapse. There has to be something we can do, some way to—" Tommy's voice cut through the executive's desperation. "Call your lawyers, wire money to fix the problem, send your assistants to handle it." The bunker's recycled air carried the weight of their helplessness. These were people accustomed to solving problems with resources, connections, and influence, none of which mattered when the atmosphere itself had become poison. Judge Vance approached Tommy's workstation, her movements careful and deliberate. "You knew this would happen, not specifically, but something like it. That's why you built this place." Tommy's fingers paused over the keyboard. "Military contractors talk, especially when they've had a few drinks and think they're impressing a blue-collar nobody. I listened, I learned, and I prepared." "For what price?" The question came from Margaret, who had joined them near the monitors. "You said entry came with conditions. What do you want from us?" Tommy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Want? I don't want anything from you people. I want something for someone else, someone who matters more than your stock portfolios and social standings." He pulled up a new screen, displaying architectural plans for a children's hospital. "My nephew Danny has leukemia, 8 years old. The treatment he needs costs more than I make in 5 years. Your kind of money." The pharmaceutical heiress stared at the medical files Tommy had researched, documented, and prepared. "You're ransoming our lives for a single child's treatment?" "I'm giving you the chance to prove you're worth saving," Tommy replied. "Danny's surgery is scheduled for next month, assuming he survives long enough to receive it, assuming any of us survive long enough to matter." Outside, the wind carried death through empty streets, while inside, the price of salvation hung in recycled air like a verdict waiting to be delivered. The emergency sirens had been wailing for 3 hours when Marcus finally heard the first desperate knock on his reinforced steel door. He'd been watching the feeds from his security cameras, tracking the chaos above as the toxic cloud spread through the valley like a malevolent fog. The government's evacuation orders had come too late. The highways were already clogged with abandoned vehicles, their drivers collapsed beside open doors. Marcus sat in his control room, methodically checking air filtration systems and radiation detectors, while the world above descended into hell. His bunker, carved from the hillside behind his modest trailer, had taken him 15 years to complete. Every weekend, every spare dollar from his construction jobs had gone into reinforced concrete, air scrubbers, and enough supplies to last a decade. His neighbors had called him paranoid. His ex-wife had called him obsessed. The wealthy residents of Hillcrest Estates, where he'd installed their marble countertops and custom wine cellars, had whispered about the crazy worker when they thought he couldn't hear. The knocking grew more frantic. Marcus pulled up the external camera feed on his monitor. Dr. Harrison Webb stood at his door, the same surgeon who'd refused to shake his hand after Marcus had finished renovating his study. Webb's designer suit was torn, his silver hair disheveled, and his face was pale with terror. Behind him stood 3 others Marcus recognized: Jennifer Chen, the real estate mogul who'd had him escorted off her property by security for tracking mud on her Persian rug; Robert Ashworth, the tech executive who'd made him use the servants' entrance; and Sarah Preston, the mayor's wife who'd lobbied to have his unsightly trailer removed from the neighborhood. "Please," Webb's muffled voice carried through the intercom. "We know you're in there. The gas is coming this way." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying their faces on the screen. Behind them, the evening sky had taken on an unnatural yellow tinge. Emergency broadcasts had confirmed the worst. A catastrophic failure at the chemical plant had released a cocktail of toxic agents that would render the area uninhabitable for months. The nearest evacuation center was 60 miles away, well beyond the reach of anyone caught in the cloud's path. "Marcus!" Jennifer Chen's voice cracked with desperation. "I know we've had our differences, but people are dying up here." He watched them huddle together, these titans of society reduced to begging at his door. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years they'd treated him like a piece of equipment, useful when needed, invisible when not. He'd eaten lunch alone in his truck while their housekeepers were invited into their kitchens. He'd been asked to park a quarter-mile away so his beat-up Ford wouldn't mar their pristine driveways. Another vehicle approached on the monitor, a black Mercedes that Marcus recognized immediately. City Councilman David Morrison stumbled out, his face already showing the early signs of chemical exposure: red, watering eyes and labored breathing. Morrison had spearheaded the campaign to relocate Marcus's property, citing neighborhood standards and property values. "There are 27 people at the community center," Morrison gasped into the intercom. "The building isn't sealed. They won't last another hour." Marcus switched to his aerial drone feed, watching the toxic cloud roll over Hillcrest Estates like a slow-motion avalanche. The same mansions he'd helped build were now death traps, their open floor plans and decorative ventilation systems providing no protection against the invisible killer creeping through their halls. His finger hovered over the door release button. The bunker could accommodate 15 people comfortably, maybe 20 if they were willing to sacrifice personal space. He had enough food, water, and medicine to keep them all alive until the military established a safe corridor for evacuation. The moral choice was clear. These people needed help, regardless of how they'd treated him. But Marcus had learned something about leverage during his years of being dismissed and disrespected. He'd watched these people negotiate deals, manipulate contracts, and extract every advantage from their positions of power. They'd never acted out of pure altruism. Everything came with terms, conditions, and careful calculations of self-interest. "I can help you," Marcus finally spoke into the intercom, his voice calm and measured. "My shelter is fully equipped for extended isolation. You'll be safe here." Relief flooded their faces, and Dr. Webb stepped closer to the door. "Thank God. We'll never forget this, Marcus. I swear to you." "But entry requires payment," Marcus continued, cutting off Webb's gratitude. Not money, something more valuable than what you're used to dealing in. The group exchanged glances, confusion replacing their initial relief. Morrison wiped his streaming eyes with a blood-stained handkerchief. What kind of payment? Marcus smiled grimly as he watched them squirm. The toxic cloud was less than a mile away now, advancing with the certainty of death itself. Time was running out, and for the first time in his life he held all the cards. The emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the bunker's main room as Marcus stood before the assembled group, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and barely contained desperation. The air recycling system hummed steadily overhead, a mechanical reminder that their lives depended entirely on his foresight and preparation. "You can't be serious about this." Victoria Ashford's voice cracked, despite her attempt at authority. Her designer clothes were wrinkled now, her perfect hair disheveled. "You're talking about some kind of primitive trial by combat." Marcus remained calm, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "I'm talking about accountability. Each of you has made decisions that destroyed lives. Now you'll face the consequences." Senator Harrison stepped forward, his political instincts kicking in. "Marcus, let's discuss this rationally. Whatever grievances you have, whatever injustices you've suffered, we can address them properly once we're out of here." "Like you addressed them when I testified before your committee?" Marcus's voice remained level, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "When I warned about the chemical plant safety violations? When I begged you to listen because I knew people would die?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the wind howled against the bunker's reinforced exterior, carrying with it the invisible death that made the surface world uninhabitable. James Holloway, the pharmaceutical executive, shifted nervously. "We followed all protocols. Every decision was made within legal parameters." Legal. Marcus tasted the word like poison. "Tell that to Sarah Chen's daughter, 8 years old when the experimental drug trials you falsified gave her permanent liver damage. Her family lost everything paying for treatments you knew wouldn't work." Victoria's complexion paled. "How could you possibly know about—" "I know everything." Marcus gestured to a bank of monitors along the wall. 5 years I spent documenting your crimes. Every bribe, every cover-up, every life destroyed for profit. I've been preparing for this moment longer than I've been building this bunker." The group exchanged glances, the reality of their situation beginning to crystallize. They weren't just refugees from a chemical disaster, they were prisoners in a carefully orchestrated reckoning. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "What exactly do you want from us?" Marcus walked to a metal cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound journal. "Confessions. Full details of every crime, every person you've wronged, every life you've destroyed in your climb to power, written in your own hand. And if we refuse—" Harrison's political bluster was failing him. "Then you leave." Marcus's response was simple, final. "You'd murder us," Victoria whispered. "I'd give you the same choice you gave my neighbors when you approved that chemical plant. The same choice you gave cancer patients when you buried treatment research for profit margins. The same choice you gave families when you voted against safety regulations." Marcus's voice never rose, but each word hit like a physical blow. "You can take your chances. Outside, just like they had to take their chances with your decisions." The pharmaceutical executive's face flushed red. "This is extortion." "This is justice." A new voice cut through the tension, soft, uncertain. "What happens after we write these confessions?" It was Amanda Price, the judge's daughter. She'd been quiet since arriving, clearly struggling with withdrawal from whatever substances had been sustaining her privileged lifestyle. Marcus studied her for a moment. "That depends on what you write, and whether you mean it. You can't hold us here indefinitely," Harrison protested. "People will come looking." "Will they?" Marcus asked. "The same people who covered for your pharmaceutical fraud? The ones who helped bury the chemical plant reports? The emergency responders who've been paid to look the other way?" He shook his head. The only people who might come looking are the ones you've spent years avoiding, the families you've destroyed. Dr. Warren stepped closer to the journal Marcus held. How do we know you'll honor your word if we comply? You don't, just like the families you've wronged never knew if you'd honor yours. Marcus set the journal on the central table. But I'll give you something they never got, a real choice with full knowledge of the consequences. The bunker's lights flickered momentarily, and everyone tensed. Marcus checked a nearby gauge and adjusted a valve with practiced efficiency. The lights steadied. The air recycling system runs on a delicate balance, he explained conversationally. Takes constant monitoring, precise adjustments. One mistake, and this place becomes as deadly as the surface. The implication hung heavy in the recycled air. Their lives depended not just on his bunker, but on his continued cooperation. Victoria sank into one of the metal chairs. How long do we have to decide? Marcus checked his watch. The confession booth opens tomorrow at dawn. Until then, you might want to search your consciences, assuming you can still find them. As he walked toward his private quarters, the sound of desperate whispers filled the main chamber behind him. The metal door groaned shut behind the senator's wife, the echo reverberating through the concrete corridors like a death knell. Marcus watched through the security monitor as she stumbled into the grey dawn, her designer dress torn and stained, her perfectly styled hair now a disheveled mess. The toxin levels outside had dropped to barely survivable. She might make it a few miles before her lungs gave out. "You're getting soft," Elena observed from her position at the communication console. "A week ago, you would have thrown her out without the gas mask." Marcus didn't respond. He'd learned that Elena's provocations were tests, probing for weaknesses she could exploit later. The pharmaceutical heiress had adapted faster than the others to the bunker's harsh dynamics, her corporate instincts serving her well in this new hierarchy. A sharp crack echoed from the common area. Marcus sighed, recognizing the sound, another piece of expensive furniture being fed to the makeshift fire they used for cooking. The bunker's kitchen facilities could only handle so much, and with 18 people still crammed into spaces designed for 6, improvisation had become survival. He found Judge Hartwell breaking apart what appeared to be a mahogany jewelry box, his movements sharp and violent. The old man's hands shook, not from exertion but from the withdrawal. Marcus had cut everyone's alcohol rations 2 days ago when supplies ran dangerously low. "Your wife?" Marcus asked. Hartwell's jaw tightened. "Said she couldn't watch what I've become." He threw another piece of wood onto the fire, sparks dancing up toward the ventilation grate. 43 years of marriage, and she walks away because I wouldn't share my water ration with the Pemberton boy. The Pemberton boy was actually 26, heir to a hotel fortune, and currently running a fever that put him at risk of dehydration. In the old world, Hartwell would have bent over backward to curry favor with the family. Down here, water was life, and sharing meant potentially condemning yourself. "She made her choice," Marcus said simply. "Did she?" Hartwell's voice carried a bitter edge. "Or did you orchestrate this? Break us down until we turn on each other. Make your little social experiment more interesting?" Before Marcus could answer, Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, his medical bag clutched against his chest. "The banker's daughter, Christina. She's hemorrhaging. The miscarriage. There are complications." The news sent a ripple through the bunker's social fabric. Christina Rothschild had hidden her pregnancy until it became impossible to conceal. The stress, poor nutrition, and psychological pressure had taken their toll. Marcus had allocated extra medical supplies when the bleeding started, but resources were finite. "What do you need?" Marcus asked. Morrison's hands trembled slightly. "The surgical kit from the restricted medical cache, and blood. She'll need a transfusion." The restricted cache contained antibiotics, surgical instruments, and other supplies Marcus had reserved for the worst-case scenarios. Using them now meant having nothing left for future emergencies. And blood transfusions required willing donors, something that had become increasingly rare as the group's solidarity crumbled. "Take what you need from the cache," Marcus decided. "As for blood donors, I'll do it." The voice came from an unexpected source, Vincent Ashworth, the tech mogul who did barely spoken to anyone since his brother's expulsion 3 days ago. We're the same blood type. I checked when she first started showing symptoms. Morrison nodded gratefully, but Marcus studied Vincent's face. The billionaire's offer seemed genuine, but in the bunker's poisoned atmosphere, altruism often came with hidden agendas. 20 minutes later, as Morrison worked to stabilize Christina, Marcus found himself in the hydroponics bay, his refuge when the bunker's politics became overwhelming. The small garden represented hope, proof that life could flourish even in the darkest places. But the tomato plants looked sickly, their leaves yellowing despite his careful attention. The soil's contaminated. Elena had followed him, her footsteps silent on the metal grating, probably from when the lawyers tried to dig their own escape tunnel last week. They breached the outer wall before you stopped them, let toxins seep into the groundwater. Marcus examined the plants more closely. She was right. The contamination was subtle but spreading, slowly poisoning the very foundation of their food production. Without the garden, their long-term survival became impossible. "How long do we have?" he asked. "For the plants? Maybe 2 weeks before they're completely dead. For us?" Elena shrugged. "Depends how long the canned goods last, and how many more people you decide to kick out." The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced Morrison's return. His scrubs were blood-stained, his face grim. "She's stable but weak. The transfusion helped, but she needs rest and proper nutrition, things we can't guarantee down here." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already calculating. Christina's medical crisis had depleted their surgical supplies. The garden was dying. The group's cohesion continued to fracture with each difficult decision. And outside, the toxin levels showed no signs of dropping to truly safe levels. The bunker had saved them from immediate death, but Marcus was beginning to realize that survival and salvation were very different things. Marcus stood at the threshold of his workshop, watching the group huddle together in the main bunker space. 3 days underground had stripped away their polished facades, revealing the raw desperation beneath. Victoria Chen clutched her designer purse like a life preserver, while Senator Blackwood's usually immaculate silver hair hung in greasy strands across his forehead. Only Dr. Sarah Martinez seemed to maintain some semblance of composure, though even she jumped at every mechanical sound the bunker made. The air recycling system hummed steadily overhead, a reminder of their precarious situation. Marcus had built every component himself, testing and retesting until he was certain it could sustain 8 people for the promised 2 weeks. But watching these strangers consume his carefully rationed supplies with the entitlement they'd carried their entire lives made his jaw clench. "We need to discuss the sleeping arrangements," Victoria announced, her voice carrying that familiar note of authority despite their circumstances. "I require a private space. My anxiety medications—" "There are no private spaces," Marcus cut her off, stepping into the circle. "Everyone sleeps in the main area. That's how it works down here." Thomas Whitmore, the real estate mogul who'd blocked Marcus's housing project 2 years ago, scoffed. "Surely you can make some accommodations. We're not common refugees." The words hung in the recycled air like a toxic cloud. Marcus felt something dark and cold settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd carried through years of rejection letters, condescending meetings, and closed doors. "Common refugees," he repeated slowly. "Is that what you think this is about?" Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her medical training evident in how she read the dangerous shift in Marcus's demeanor. "What Mr. Whitmore means is—" He moved to the central control panel, his calloused fingers dancing over switches they couldn't begin to comprehend. The bunker's lighting dimmed to emergency levels, bathing them all in an amber glow that made shadows stretch across the concrete walls like grasping fingers. "The toxin cloud isn't dissipating," Marcus continued, pulling up readings on a screen they couldn't see clearly from their angle. "In fact, it's getting worse. The chemical reaction with atmospheric moisture is creating secondary compounds, more dangerous ones. Councilwoman Patricia Hoffman's face went pale. How much longer until? 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we're lucky. Marcus turned back to face them, and in the amber light, his expression was unreadable. Double what I originally calculated. The silence stretched until Victoria's voice cracked through it. But you said 2 weeks of supplies. I said I had 2 weeks of supplies for the people I planned to save. Marcus's smile was sharp as a blade. My neighbors, the families you've spent years pushing out of their homes with your development projects and zoning changes, the workers whose safety regulations you voted against to save money, the people you've never bothered to learn the names of. Thomas stepped forward, his business instincts kicking in despite their circumstances. What do you want? Money? We can pay. Pay? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. With what? The money you made tearing down affordable housing, the profits from cutting corners on construction safety, the campaign contributions that bought votes against environmental protection? Senator Blackwood's political training finally engaged. Now see here, son, whatever grievances you have. Grievances. The word dripped with venom. 23 workers injured on Whitmore's last project because he refused to pay for proper safety equipment. Mrs. Chen's pharmaceutical company knew about liver damage from their pain medication for 2 years before pulling it from market. The senators vote against the toxin warning system that could have prevented this entire disaster. Each accusation landed like a physical blow. They weren't random victims of circumstance, they were specifically chosen. You researched us, Dr. Martinez said quietly, understanding dawning in her voice. For years, Marcus nodded. Every public record, every news article, every closed-door deal that somehow became public knowledge. You want to know the real price of admission to my bunker? He reached into his workshop and emerged with a thick folder, papers spilling from its edges. Financial records, medical reports, correspondence, evidence of corruption, negligence, and greed spanning decades. Truth, Marcus said simply. Full confessions. Every dirty deal, every life you've destroyed for profit, every time you've chosen money over human decency. All of it, recorded and documented. That's how you earn your oxygen down here. The amber emergency lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, they finally understood. They weren't guests in Marcus's bunker. They were prisoners in his court, and he was both judge and jury in a trial that had been years in the making. The emergency radio crackled to life at dawn, jolting Marcus from his restless sleep against the concrete wall. Through the static, a voice emerged. Official, clipped, desperate. Containment efforts have failed. Toxin levels rising in sectors 7 through 12. Military evacuation suspended indefinitely. All civilians advised to remain in secure locations. Victoria stirred beside him, her designer clothes now wrinkled and stained. Across the bunker, the others began to wake. Senator Hayes clutching his chest, Dr. Chen checking on her unconscious husband, and the Whitmore family huddled together like frightened animals. Marcus switched off the radio before the full broadcast could sink in. No point in adding to their despair. He'd heard enough to know the truth. They weren't getting out any time soon. What did it say? Victoria's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Nothing new. The lie came easily. Marcus had learned long ago that sometimes kindness meant withholding the truth. He stood, his knees protesting after another night on the floor, and moved to check the air filtration system. Senator Hayes struggled to his feet, his face gray with exhaustion. We need to discuss rationing more seriously. The food won't last another week at this pace. Already calculated, Marcus replied without turning around. 14 days if we cut portions by 30%, 18 if we go to starvation rations. Starvation? Patricia Whitmore's voice cracked. You can't be serious. Marcus faced them, his expression grim. The alternatives, everyone dies in 10 days instead of some of us surviving for 18. Your choice. The weight of leadership pressed down on him like a physical force. These people who had spent their lives commanding others, making decisions that affected thousands, now looked to him for answers he didn't have. Dr. Chen cleared her throat. My husband's condition is deteriorating. Without proper medical equipment. She didn't finish the sentence. Marcus nodded. He'd noticed Chen's labored breathing, the way his skin had taken on a grayish pallor. The stress was killing him slowly, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. I've been thinking, Victoria said suddenly, about what you said, about owing you. The bunker fell silent except for the steady hum of the air recyclers. Marcus waited. I own controlling interest in Meridian Construction. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. When we get out of here, I want to offer you a position, Vice President of Operations. Senator Hayes scoffed. Really, Victoria? You think throwing money at the man will... It's not about money. Her eyes remained fixed on Marcus. It's about recognizing worth. Something I should have done long ago. Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger, but it was different now, dulled by exhaustion and the strange intimacy that came from shared survival. You think a fancy title changes anything? I think it's a start. James Whitmore Jr. spoke up from the corner where he'd been unusually quiet. My father always said the measure of a man isn't what he owns, but what he builds. He looked directly at his father. You never built anything, did you, Dad? You just moved money around and called it business. The elder Whitmore's face reddened. How dare you? No. The young man's voice was steady, resolute. How dare you? How dare any of us? This man saved our lives, and we're still acting like we're better than him. Patricia reached for her son's arm, but he pulled away. When we get out of here, if we get out of here, I'm done. Done with the company, done with the lifestyle, done pretending that accidents of birth make us superior to people like Marcus. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus studied the young man's face, seeing something he'd rarely encountered in the wealthy elite, genuine remorse mixed with determination. Dr. Chen's medical training kicked in as her husband's breathing became more labored. She knelt beside him, checking his pulse. His heart rate is irregular. The stress is too much. Marcus moved to his supply cabinet and retrieved a small bottle of aspirin, part of his carefully hoarded medical supplies. He handed it to Dr. Chen without a word. She looked at him with surprise. This could be the difference between life and death for any of us if we're injured. He needs it more than we might. The simple act seemed to break something open in the room. Senator Hayes lowered himself back to the floor with a heavy sigh. You know, I've spent 30 years in politics, thinking I was serving people, but I don't think I ever actually saw them. Not really. Victoria moved closer to Marcus. What you're doing for us, it's more than we deserve. Marcus met her gaze. Maybe, but it's who I choose to be. Outside, the world continued to die. Inside the bunker, something unexpected was taking root among the survivors, the possibility of redemption. The emergency radio crackled to life just as Marcus finished his morning rounds, checking the air filtration system for the third time since dawn. The voice that emerged from the static made everyone in the common area freeze. This is Emergency Command Station Alpha. All survivors in Grid Section 7, please respond. We have confirmation that the toxic cloud has shifted northeast and is expected to clear the downtown corridor within 72 hours. Repeat, downtown corridor should be safe for limited exposure within 72 hours. Victoria dropped her cup of instant coffee, the metallic clang echoing through the sudden silence. After 2 weeks underground, the word outside had taken on an almost mythical quality. Did they say 72 hours? Jonathan's voice cracked like a teenager's. The pharmaceutical executive who once commanded boardrooms now looked like a man emerging from a fever dream. Marcus reached for the radio transmitter, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle on the controls. Emergency Command, this is Underground Facility 47B. We have 8 survivors, all in good health. What are the protocols for emergence? The response came through layers of static. Facility 47B, you'll need full decontamination procedures and medical screening. Transport vehicles will begin sweeps starting Monday morning. Maintain current shelter status until official clearance. Dr. Peterson leaned forward from her corner where she'd been reading a water-damaged paperback. What about the toxin residue? Even if the cloud passes, there could be surface contamination for weeks. Marcus had been thinking the same thing. He'd built this bunker for chemical disasters, but he'd also studied the aftermath. The real danger often came from what settled after the immediate threat passed. Command, what's the contamination status for building surfaces and water supplies? Marcus spoke into the radio. A different voice answered this time, more authoritative. All survivors should assume surface contamination will persist for an estimated 2 to 4 weeks post-clearance. Sealed water sources should be tested before consumption. Avoid contact with exterior building surfaces and vegetation. Senator Reynolds, who had spent the past 3 days in sullen silence after losing another game of chess to Elena, suddenly stood up. 2 to 4 weeks? I have a Senate hearing next Thursday. The Infrastructure Committee can't proceed without me. The absurdity of the statement hung in the recycled air. Elena actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made everyone turn. A hearing? Richard, there might not be a committee left. Half of Congress was in Washington when this happened. Marcus watched the growing panic in their eyes as the reality settled in. These people had built their identities around schedules, meetings, obligations that suddenly seemed as distant as Mars. Down here, time had been suspended. Soon they'd have to face whatever remained of the world above. Marcus, Dr. Peterson said quietly, what's your exit strategy? Have you planned for post-emergence protocols? He had, actually. More than they knew. The bunker had a decontamination chamber he hadn't mentioned yet, along with radiation detectors that worked for chemical contamination. He'd also stockpiled enough supplies to last well beyond the official clearance periods. But as he looked around the circle of faces, Elena sketching in her notebook, Tyler organizing the medical supplies with obsessive precision, even the chef Andre carefully rationing their remaining food, Marcus realized something had changed in him too. We don't have to leave immediately, he said finally. This place can sustain us for another month if needed. We could wait until we're certain it's safe. Another month? Victoria's voice pitched higher. Marcus, I appreciate everything you've done, but we have lives up there, responsibilities. What lives? Elena didn't look up from her sketching. Victoria, your modeling agency is probably gone. Half the financial district might be uninhabitable. Tyler cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. She's right. We need to consider that the world we're returning to might be fundamentally different. The economic disruption alone... Stop. Senator Reynolds held up a hand. Just stop. We don't know anything yet. Once we're out, once we can assess the actual damage, we can make rational decisions about rebuilding. Marcus found himself studying the senator's face, recognizing something he'd seen in construction sites during project delays. The desperate need to believe that setbacks were temporary, that original plans could simply be resumed once obstacles were cleared. But Marcus had also seen projects where the delays revealed fundamental flaws in the foundation. Sometimes the wisest choice was to start over completely. There's something else, he said, surprising himself. The radio said transport vehicles would be making sweeps. They didn't say anything about individualized pickup. We might be taken to processing centers, refugee camps. We might not have control over where we go or when. The implications settled over them like a heavy blanket. After 2 weeks of small group dynamics and shared decision-making, the prospect of being absorbed back into institutional systems felt oddly threatening. Elena finally looked up from her notebook. How long could we really stay, Marcus, if we wanted to? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Marcus heard what she was really asking, whether the bunker could become something more than shelter, whether it could become a choice. The emergency radio crackled to life at dawn, cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the bunker like a burial shroud. Marcus wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag and reached for the device. his weathered fingers trembling slightly as static filled the reinforced concrete chamber. "This is Emergency Broadcast Station Alpha 7, Day 6 of the Hartwell chemical incident. Toxin levels remain critically high in a 12-mile radius. All civilians are advised to remain in secure, filtered environments. Rescue operations continue to be delayed indefinitely." Victoria Hartwell's sharp intake of breath echoed from the corner where she sat hunched over her daughter's makeshift bed. Emma's condition had deteriorated overnight, her breathing more labored, her fever climbing despite Marcus's carefully rationed medical supplies. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very toxin that had escaped from her family's chemical plant was now slowly poisoning the Hartwell heiress. "How much longer can the filtration system hold?" asked Dr. Reynolds, adjusting his cracked glasses. The respected surgeon looked nothing like the man who had dismissed Marcus as the help just days earlier. Now, his expensive suit hung like a tattered flag of his former privilege. Marcus studied the gauges on the wall, their green lights flickering occasionally to amber. "Maybe 2 more days if we're lucky. The filters weren't designed for this duration of exposure." He paused, watching their faces drain of color. "But that's not our biggest problem." James Carrington looked up from his corner, where he'd been obsessively checking his dead phone. "What do you mean?" "Food and water." Marcus gestured toward the depleted supply shelves. "I built this place for my family of 4, maybe 5 people max. We've got 12 souls down here now, including the Peterson family from next door." He met each of their gazes steadily. "At current consumption, we've got 36 hours before we're drinking recycled air moisture and chewing on hope." The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Above their heads, the world remained a toxic wasteland. But down here, in Marcus's carefully constructed sanctuary, different survival calculations were taking shape. "There has to be something we can do," whispered Sarah Carrington, unconsciously clutching her pearl necklace, the only jewelry she'd managed to grab during their desperate flight to the bunker. "Money has to count for something, even now." Marcus almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat when he saw Emma's pale face. The girl was maybe 16, guilty of nothing except being born into wealth. "Your money's worthless down here, Mrs. Carrington. Has been since the moment you crawled through that hatch. But surely you have connections," James pressed. "Other contractors, people who might have supplies nearby." "You still don't get it." Marcus's voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with sleepless nights. "For 20 years, I've watched you people drive past my house like it was invisible. Your wife crossed the street rather than acknowledge my daughter at the grocery store. You treated me like furniture when I renovated your kitchen." He gestured around the bunker. "This place exists because I knew that when disaster struck, people like you would save yourselves first and leave people like me to die." Victoria finally spoke, her voice hoarse from hours of whispering prayers over Emma's bedside. "You're right. We failed you, failed everyone who wasn't part of our insulated world. But Emma," her voice cracked, "she's just a child." The weight of unspoken decisions pressed down on them like the tons of earth above their heads. Marcus had designed this bunker with contingencies, including ones he'd hoped never to use. Hidden behind a false panel lay emergency rations, enough to extend their survival by perhaps a week. But feeding 12 people instead of 4 meant impossible choices. Young Tommy Peterson, barely 8 years old, chose that moment to ask his mother when they could go home and play in the backyard again. The question hung in the recycled air like an accusation, innocent and devastating. Marcus closed his eyes and saw his own daughter, safely evacuated to her college 3 states away before the disaster struck. She'd called him the night before the leak, laughing about a boy she'd met, complaining about cafeteria food. Ordinary problems from a world that might no longer exist by the time the toxins cleared. When he opened his eyes, he found Victoria Hartwell watching him with desperate hope. Behind her, Emma's breathing rattled like autumn leaves against a window. "There might be a way," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it would mean someone has to go outside." The words fell into the group like stones into still water. sending ripples of fear and desperate calculation across their faces. Outside meant certain death within minutes of exposure, but inside meant slow starvation for all of them. Marcus reached for the hidden panel, knowing that his next decision would determine who lived and who died in the democracy of desperation he'd never wanted to rule. The steel door groaned as Marcus pulled it shut behind the last group to leave. Elena watched from across the main chamber, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the notebook where she'd been documenting everything, every conversation, every revelation, every transformation she'd witnessed in the depths of this concrete sanctuary. "That's the third group this week," Marcus said, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually steady hands trembled slightly as he engaged the complex locking mechanism. The bunker felt different now, emptier despite still housing nearly 40 people. The initial panic had given way to something more insidious, a creeping uncertainty that gnawed at everyone's resolve. Above ground, the world was slowly healing, but down here, in the place that had saved them all, fractures were spreading through their makeshift community like hairline cracks in concrete. "They're scared," Elena observed, closing the notebook and moving closer to him. "Not of the toxin anymore, but of what comes after." Marcus nodded, his gaze sweeping across the common area where clusters of people sat in hushed conversation. The invisible barriers between the former social classes had blurred considerably, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. If anything, new divisions had emerged, between those ready to face the uncertain world above and those who couldn't imagine leaving the safety of these walls. Dr. Catherine Reeves approached them, her once pristine appearance now as worn as everyone else's. The past weeks had stripped away more than just her designer clothes. They'd peeled back layers of pretense Elena had thought were permanent fixtures of the woman's personality. "The latest reports suggest the contamination levels in Sector 7 have dropped below critical thresholds," Catherine said, holding up a handheld radio device. "That's where most of the Hendersons' properties are located. They could theoretically return home. But they're not leaving," Marcus replied. It wasn't a question. Catherine shook her head. "Richard keeps finding reasons to delay. He claims he's waiting for absolute confirmation, but—" She paused, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I think he's afraid of losing what he's found here." Elena understood. The bunker had become more than a shelter. It had become a place where worth wasn't measured in bank account figures or stock portfolios. Here, Richard Henderson's ability to organize supply rotations mattered more than his real estate empire. Here, Margaret Chen's talent for mediating disputes was valued over her corporate law practice. "We can't stay down here forever," Elena said quietly. "This was never meant to be a permanent community." Marcus's jaw tightened. She could see the conflict playing across his features, pride in what they'd built together, warring with the practical knowledge that the bunker was meant for survival, not as a replacement for the world above. Young Tommy Morrison burst into their conversation, his face flushed with excitement despite the perpetual pallor they'd all developed from weeks without natural sunlight. "Marcus, you need to see this." He held up a tablet displaying what looked like architectural blueprints. "I've been working on designs for above-ground structures that incorporate your bunker principles, community spaces that prioritize function and cooperation over status symbols." The enthusiasm in Tommy's voice was infectious, but Elena noticed how it made Marcus withdraw slightly. She recognized that look, the wariness of a man who'd spent too many years having his ideas dismissed or stolen by those who considered themselves his betters. That's good work, Tommy," Marcus said carefully, "but those are your designs now." "No, you don't understand," Tommy pressed on, his young idealism bulldozing through the subtle rejection. "I want to build these with you. We could start a firm, revolutionize how we think about community spaces. The Henderson Foundation could provide initial funding." No, the word came out sharper than Marcus intended, causing several nearby conversations to pause. He lowered his voice but maintained his firm tone. "When we all leave here, we go back to our own lives. That was always the deal." Elena saw the hurt flash across Tommy's face, followed quickly by confusion. The young man had genuinely believed that the bonds forged in crisis would naturally extend into the world beyond these walls. But Marcus, ever the realist, understood what Elena was beginning to grasp herself. The bunker existed outside normal social structures precisely because it was temporary. As Tommy walked away, deflated, Catherine placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. He meant it as a compliment, you know. He sees you as an equal now. Does he? Marcus's voice carried decades of skepticism. Or does he see someone useful to him? Someone whose knowledge he can incorporate into his own success? The question hung in the recycled air between them, highlighting the fundamental challenge they all faced. Down here, they'd learned to value each other as human beings. But the world above still operated on the same principles that had created the divides between them in the first place. Elena opened her notebook again, pen poised over a fresh page. She had a feeling the real story was just beginning. Marcus stood at the reinforced door, his weathered hand resting on the manual release lever. Through the small porthole window, he could see the faint outline of emergency vehicles in the distance, their lights cutting through the toxic haze that still clung to the surface like a malevolent fog. 3 days had passed since the chemical plant explosion, and the authorities had finally arrived. Behind him, the bunker hummed with nervous energy. The 12 survivors who had initially entered his sanctuary had been whittled down to 9. 2 had succumbed to pre-existing conditions exacerbated by stress, and 1, Richard Blackwood, had suffered a fatal heart attack during yesterday's confrontation about food rationing. The remaining occupants sat in clusters, their designer clothes now wrinkled and stained, their faces bearing the hollow look of people who had glimpsed their own mortality. Victoria Ashford pressed her manicured fingers against her temples, fighting off another headache. The pharmaceutical heiress who had once commanded boardrooms now struggled to maintain her composure in the cramped quarters. She caught Marcus watching her and forced a weak smile. "You're thinking about opening it, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Marcus nodded slowly. "Air quality sensors show it's safe enough for short exposure. Those hazmat teams out there, they're the real deal, not some corporate cleanup crew trying to minimize liability." Senator Hayes overheard and approached, his political instincts still sharp despite his haggard appearance. "What guarantees do we have that they won't ask questions? Some of us have reputations to consider." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity. Even now, even after everything they'd been through, Hayes was worried about his image. The senator had spent the last 72 hours begging for food, water, and shelter, yet he still clung to his sense of entitlement. "Your reputation." Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Let me tell you about reputation, Senator. Down here, your reputation is what you've earned, and from where I'm standing, that's not much." The bunker fell silent, except for the steady hum of the air filtration system. Marcus had become a different man over these 3 days. The quiet construction worker who had always deferred to his social betters had evolved into something harder, more decisive. He had watched these people reveal their true natures when stripped of their wealth and status, and the experience had changed him irrevocably. Dr. Elizabeth Winters, the only person who had consistently treated him with respect, moved closer to the window. "The question isn't whether we can leave," she said thoughtfully. "It's whether we should. Marcus, you've created something remarkable here. Not just the bunker, though that's impressive, but what you've taught us about ourselves." "Taught you?" Marcus turned to face the group. "I didn't teach you anything. I just removed your safety nets and watched you fall." Judge Patterson, who had remained largely silent since his authority had proven meaningless in the confined space, cleared his throat. "We all made mistakes down here, said things we shouldn't have. But surely you understand that desperation makes people—" "No." Marcus's interruption was sharp and final. "Desperation doesn't make people anything. It reveals who they already were." He walked to the supply cabinet and retrieved a small notebook, his personal journal where he had documented everything that had occurred. Names, dates, conversations, betrayals. the complete record of how the city's elite had behaved when they thought no one was watching. Victoria's eyes widened as she recognized what he held. "Marcus, what are you planning to do with that?" "I haven't decided yet," he replied honestly. "But I know this. When we walk out that door, everything changes. You'll go back to your mansions and boardrooms, and I'll go back to my job sites, but I'll remember. And now I have proof of who you really are when the masks come off." The sound of voices approached from outside, rescue workers calling out, searching for survivors. Marcus could hear them clearly through the bunker's audio sensors. Real help had arrived, not the half-hearted efforts of the first day when corporate interests had tried to control the narrative. He looked around at the faces watching him, some fearful, some defiant, all changed by their shared ordeal. They had learned that survival had nothing to do with bank accounts or social status. They had discovered that the man they had dismissed as beneath their notice held skills they desperately needed. Most importantly, they had revealed their true characters under pressure. Marcus's hand moved to the door release. Outside, fresh air and freedom waited. Inside, the artificial environment that had preserved their lives was about to become history. But the lessons learned in this underground sanctuary would endure long after they returned to the surface. The toxin may have dissipated, but the poison of their revealed natures would prove far more lasting. Marcus smiled grimly and began to turn the release wheel. It was time to see what price his temporary gods were willing to pay for their sins in the world above. The static from Marcus's radio crackled through the bunker like electricity, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over everyone. Victoria watched from her corner as he hunched over the device, his weathered fingers adjusting dials with the precision of someone who'd done this countless times before. "Emergency broadcast, partial containment achieved in sectors 7 and 9. The voice was barely audible through the interference, but every word felt like a lifeline being thrown into dark water. Dr. Reeves leaned forward, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained. "Can you get a clearer signal?" Marcus shot him a look that could have cut glass. "You want to go up there and adjust the antenna yourself, Doc?" The wealthy physician fell silent, and Victoria noticed how the power dynamics had completely shifted. Just days ago, Dr. Reeves wouldn't have given Marcus a second glance. Now he hung on every word the construction worker spoke. Estimated timeline for full decontamination remains unclear. Citizens advised to maintain shelter protocols. Sarah Chen sat beside her husband, their twin daughters pressed close. The girls had been remarkably resilient, but Victoria could see the strain wearing on Sarah. Her designer clothes hung loose, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "How much longer?" Sarah whispered, to no one in particular. It was James Hoffman who answered, his voice hollow. "However long Marcus decides to keep us here." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus slowly turned from the radio, his expression unreadable. "You got something you want to say, Hoffman?" "Just stating facts." James's tone carried that familiar arrogance, though it seemed forced now. "You're in complete control. We can't leave without your permission." Victoria felt the tension crackling between the two men like a live wire. She'd watched this dynamic building for days, James's growing resentment at being dependent on someone he considered beneath him, and Marcus's barely contained anger at the man who'd fired him with such casual cruelty. "That's right," Marcus said quietly. "I am in control. Funny how things work out." Dr. Reeves cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should focus on the positive news. If they're achieving containment—" "Partial containment," Marcus corrected, "in 2 sectors out of 15. You want to take your chances out there, be my guest." Victoria stood up, sensing the conversation heading toward dangerous territory. "We're all frustrated, but fighting each other won't help." Marcus's laugh was bitter. "Fighting? Lady, you don't know what fighting is. Fighting is working 60-hour weeks to keep food on the table while guys like him," he pointed at James, "decide your worth based on the price of your shoes." "You're being dramatic," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Marcus stepped closer. "You remember what you said when you fired me? You said I was expendable, that the company needed to trim the fat. That's what you called me, fat to be trimmed. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children seemed to sense the weight of the moment. That's just business, James stammered. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. Marcus repeated the words slowly, as if tasting something bitter. Losing my health insurance when my wife was sick, that was nothing personal. Having to sell our car to pay for her medications, nothing personal. Watching her stress about money while she was dying, just business, right? Victoria felt her chest tighten. She'd never heard Marcus speak about his wife before, and the raw pain in his voice was almost unbearable. I didn't know, James said weakly. Course you didn't. Why would you? I was just another number on a spreadsheet to you. The radio crackled again, breaking the moment. Rescue operations continuing. Temporary shelters established for displaced residents. Marcus turned back to the radio, his shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion. Victoria watched James struggle with something, guilt perhaps, or the first real recognition of what his decisions had cost. Marcus, Victoria said gently, your wife, what was she like? For a moment, his hard expression softened. She was everything good about this world. Kind, patient. She'd have let all of you in here without thinking twice. He paused, his voice catching slightly. But she's not here. I am. And I remember exactly how each of you treated people like me before this happened. Sarah Chen spoke up, her voice barely audible. What do you want from us? Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at the radio as if it held answers to questions he'd been carrying for years. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through the bunker. I want you to understand what it feels like to be truly powerless, to know your life depends entirely on someone else's mercy. He turned to face them all, his eyes hard as stone. I want you to know how it feels to be expendable. The confession hung in the recycled air like a poison more toxic than anything seeping through the earth above. Marcus stood motionless, his weathered hands still gripping the water valve he'd been adjusting when Victoria's words shattered the fragile peace they'd built in their underground sanctuary. Say that again. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a man watching his world collapse for the second time in a week. Victoria Ashford sat slumped against the concrete wall, her designer clothes now little more than expensive rags after days in the bunker. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms and charity galas looked smaller somehow, diminished by the truth she'd finally spoken aloud. The leak wasn't an accident, Marcus. The company knew about the structural weaknesses in the storage facility. We all knew. The other survivors, Judge Harrison, Senator Coleman, tech mogul Bradley Chen, and oil executive Robert Kane, shifted uncomfortably in the cramped space. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the steady hum of the air filtration system that had kept them alive while their city died above. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes scanning each face in turn. These people he'd fed, sheltered and protected. These people whose lives he'd saved without question when they'd come pounding on his bunker door 3 days ago, choking on the toxic cloud that had swallowed downtown in minutes. How long? He asked, his voice gaining strength. How long did you know? Senator Coleman cleared his throat, the politician in him searching for careful words. The initial report suggested possible. Don't Marcus's command cut through the air like a blade. No more politician speak, no more corporate doublespeak. How long? It was Judge Harrison who answered, his judicial composure cracking. 18 months. The engineering report started coming in 18 months ago. Jesus Christ. Marcus sank onto an overturned crate, his head in his hands. 18 months. You knew for 18 months that this could happen, and you did nothing. Victoria's voice was barely audible. There were cost considerations. Relocating the facility would have meant... Cost considerations? Marcus looked up, and for the first time since they'd known him, there was something dangerous in his eyes. My daughter worked 6 blocks from that plant. 6 blocks. The bunker fell silent again. They all knew about Sarah, Marcus's daughter, The teacher who'd been caught in the initial wave of the leak, the daughter whose body lay somewhere in the poisoned wasteland above, along with thousands of others who'd never had a chance to reach safety. Bradley Chen, who'd remained quiet through most of their underground exile, finally spoke up. "Marcus, we understand you're angry." "Angry?" Marcus stood abruptly, his frame filling the small space. "Angry is when someone cuts you off in traffic. Angry is when your football team loses. This is something else entirely." He moved to the control panel that regulated their life support systems, the complex array of switches and monitors he'd built with his own hands over years of careful planning and preparation. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The man they'd dismissed as just another blue-collar worker had created the only thing standing between them and certain death. "You want to know something funny?" Marcus continued, his fingers hovering over the controls. "I built this bunker because I didn't trust the system. Because I knew that when things went bad, people like me, regular people, would be left behind. I never imagined I'd end up saving the very people responsible for the disaster." Robert Kane leaned forward, his oil executive's mind immediately grasping the shift in dynamics. "Now hold on, Marcus. We're all victims here. We're all trapped." "Are we?" Marcus turned back to face them. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like some of us are trapped, and some of us are exactly where we deserve to be." The weight of his words settled over them like a shroud. For the first time since entering the bunker, they began to understand that their salvation might come with a price they hadn't anticipated. Victoria struggled to her feet, desperation creeping into her voice. "Marcus, please, I know what we did was wrong. I know we should have acted sooner. But we can't change that now. We can only move forward." Marcus finished for her. "Make amends? Use this as a learning experience?" He shook his head slowly. "Those are the same words you people always use. The same excuses, the same meaningless promises." He walked to the sealed door that separated them from the toxic hell above, the door only he knew how to open. His hand rested on the manual override, and for a terrifying moment none of them were certain what he might do. "My daughter believed in justice," he said quietly. "She believed that good people would do the right thing when it mattered most." He turned back to face them, and in his eyes was the look of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "I think it's time we found out if she was right." The morning sun filtered through the reinforced glass of Marcus's observation deck, casting long shadows across the control room where he sat monitoring the air quality readings. 72 hours had passed since the all-clear signal from the emergency response teams. The toxin levels outside had finally dropped below the safety threshold. Behind him, the soft hum of the bunker's life support systems continued their steady rhythm, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past week. In the common areas below, his unlikely guests stirred to consciousness, unaware that their underground exile was about to end. Marcus pulled up the final atmospheric analysis on his tablet. The numbers were clear. The deadly cloud that had blanketed the city was gone, dispersed by winds and neutralized by the military's aerial treatments. The world above was safe again. He thought about the journey that had brought them all here. Victoria Ashford, who had transformed from a dismissive socialite into someone who genuinely listened when others spoke. She had spent yesterday teaching the Warren children to play chess, her manicured fingers patient as she guided small hands across the board. Senator Phillips had shed his political armor entirely, spending hours in quiet conversation with Miguel Santos, the janitor, whose building Phillips had helped demolish through backroom deals. The banker, Harrison, remained the most resistant to change, but even he had begun to crack. Yesterday, Marcus had found him sitting alone in the workshop, turning over one of the hand-carved wooden figurines that lined the shelves, small tokens Marcus had made during long nights when sleep eluded him. "You made these?" Harrison had asked, his voice devoid of its usual condescension. "Helps me think," Marcus had replied simply. Now, as he prepared to deliver the news that would change everything once again, Marcus felt the weight of the decision he'd made in the early hours of the morning. The bunker's cameras had recorded everything, Every conversation, every moment of revelation, every breakdown and breakthrough. But he had already deleted the files. He descended to the main living area where breakfast was being prepared. The sight still amazed him. Victoria working alongside Maria Santos to prepare eggs, while Senator Phillips helped young Tommy Warren with his reading. These people who had lived in separate worlds had found common ground in the confined space of his creation. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the room. The conversations died down as faces turned toward him, and he saw something he'd never expected to see directed at him from these particular people: genuine respect, even affection. "The air quality readings came back clean," he continued. "It's safe to go outside." The silence that followed was complex, relief mixed with something harder to define, a reluctance that surprised them all. Victoria was the first to speak. "When do we need to leave?" "You don't," Marcus said quietly. "You can stay as long as you need to figure out what comes next." Senator Phillips stepped forward, his politician's instincts warring with the man he'd become over the past week. "Marcus, about what we discussed, the recordings, There are no recordings," Marcus interrupted. "Never were. What happened here stays here, unless you decide otherwise." The implications hung in the air. He was giving them their freedom, their secrets, their old lives back. No strings attached, no price to pay for their survival beyond what they'd already paid in truth and vulnerability. Harrison's laugh was bitter. "You're letting us walk away, just like that?" "That's your choice to make," Marcus replied. "All of yours." Maria Santos wiped her hands on her apron, tears glistening in her eyes. "Miguel," she whispered to her husband, "what do we do now?" It was young Sarah Warren who broke the spell. "Do we have to go back to the way things were?" The question echoed through the bunker, and Marcus watched as each person grappled with it. They had been given a gift, not just survival, but transformation. The question was whether they would choose to keep it. Victoria moved first, crossing to where Marcus stood. "Thank you," she said simply, and he understood she meant for more than just saving their lives. One by one, they began to gather their belongings, but the movements were slow, reluctant. Outside, the world waited. Their old world of divisions and hierarchies, of money and power and carefully maintained distances. As the bunker's main door cycled through its opening sequence for the first time in a week, natural light spilled down the entrance tunnel. The survivors of Marcus Webb's underground sanctuary stood at the threshold between the world that had been and the world that could be. The choice, as it always had been, was theirs to make.